We just love doing the nuclear mixers. They've become kind of a cult followed event for us, and we really enjoy it. And we have a couple of amazing guests with us today, and I'm going to, without delay, turn it over to Sarah, and I'll be back with you in just a little bit. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Letha. Well, welcome everybody. On behalf of N Square and PopTech, I am delighted you could all join us today. This is a happy hour after all, and I don't have a drink. I promise you this is water, but cheers to you all anyway. I'm thrilled to be co-hosting this virtual mixer with Letha, the president of PopTech, who's been a true friend, a collaborator, and a thought partner of N Square. My name is Sarah Kuches-Fahani, and I am the director of the N Square DC Hub, which since March has been operating here outside of my bedroom here in Washington, DC. And for those of you who are not familiar, N Square is a funders collaborative that was created in 2014 to introduce innovation and creative thinking into the nuclear risk reduction space. Today, we are really lucky to have Lauren and Emily discuss how their work in cultivating gender equity in traditionally male-dominated fields, whether that's in construction or the national security space, these two incredible women will share their experiences in empowering and teaching girls to build a world they want to see. Their amazing work supports the aspirations of girls and provide pathways into these historically male-dominated fields, while simultaneously imagining what it means to reframe entire industries with a focus on gender neutrality. Before I hand over, let me just say a quick word of thanks, first of all to Letha, my co-host, to Nick Martin and Brittany Jones, our fantastic tech change partners who are working diligently behind the scenes to make this all work. Of course, to our wonderful speakers, these two outstanding architects of change, Lauren Bean-Buita, the founder and CEO of Girls Security, and Emily Pillerton, the founder and executive director of Girls Garage. And last but by no means least, all of you for joining us today. We have a great mixture of expertise and of background, so you really do give the true meaning to the word mixer. So again, without further ado, cheers to all of you and welcome to Gender Equity. It starts by giving a girl a power tool, and I will hand it over to you, Lauren. Thank you.
That was terrific, Sarah. I feel like you do need a drink after that intro. That was fast. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I really appreciate all of you being here. I have to recognize my colleague, Erin Connolly, who's joining me on the call. If not for Erin, as a working mom in the pandemic, we could not be doing what we're doing. So she is much deserving to be speaking as I am. I'll just speak briefly about kind of the two sets of experiences that I feel as though inspired both the idea for Girl Security, but also the model. The first is I grew up in Illinois, and after 9/11, I came back to Illinois and was working at a national security think tank. I had no idea what national security was, which means I paid a lot, an overpriced education and didn't learn a whole lot that I could apply to my job. And slowly I began to understand that national security was this extremely heightened political realm. The organization that I worked for had been founded by a group of, this is not bashing, white businessmen, one of whom included Donald Rumsfeld. And so I was having this experience of working at a national security think tank. At the same time, my brother was deployed to Iraq. He was deployed once, and then he was stopped, lost, and sent back. And a very cute memory that I have of just experiencing what it was like to have a family member deployed was literally the sound of my mom when she knew that he would be sent back, because it was the sound of a mother who felt that she got lucky with her son coming back, and she knew that he would be put back in harm's way. And so I was having the personal experience of having someone deployed, and then also watching these closed door conversations happen where it was clear that the basis for why we went to Iraq was false. And so I really grappled with the fact that as an early 20-something, I would sit with my friends at bars on the weekend, and I'd want to talk about what was happening, but the kind of extent of the discourse was, do you or do you not agree with the war in Iraq? And so I really was compelled to create something that was a public education initiative aimed toward young people. And then as a woman in national security, women being underrepresented, I wanted it to be something that specifically focused on girls. And then after that, I resigned after my boss at the time behaved very inappropriately. And fortunately, I was given another opportunity, which was to lead an investigation that resulted in a whistleblower lawsuit against the city of Chicago for racial discrimination, fraudulent misuse of federal fair housing dollars, and civil rights violations. My mentor who gave me that opportunity passed away in April. But it was such a privilege because I grew up in Chicago. I knew it was the most segregated city in the nation, but through 7 years of investigative analysis, I was able to truly and deeply understand how racism becomes systemic through processes and policies that almost make it imperceptible, especially to those of us who don't necessarily experience the same level of discrimination. And so the combination of those experiences compelled me to start something that I knew would take a long time, recognizing that change takes time, but really wanting to empower girls in a way that would bring the diverse voices of girls from the South and North sides of Chicago to a discourse about national security. I don't know how many minutes I have left, but I have a quick slide I will go through very quickly just to give you a sense of the model. Let's see. I can share my screen. Okay. So our model is secure, empower, and advance. That's the basis of it. And one of the things that we emphasize in girl security is that because society creates this awful catch-22 for girls, which is to say that we tell girls that there's lots of things to be afraid of, but we really fail as a society, particularly through systems like the justice system, to protect them. So we kind of talk about girls' inherent security aptitude. At the same time, national security is piercing girls' personal security domain, specifically looking at things like disinformation, climate change, the threat of nuclear weapons. These are threats that girls are on the front lines, and they're looking for context. We work with girls across the country. We're working with girls globally. They want to talk about what's going on. They just don't have the discourse to do it. At the same time, women remained underrepresented in national security, that includes STEM in the private sector. And so they're not also seeing women role models in those spaces that are leading that discourse. And so for Girl Security, we're the first and only organization that is intentionally engaging girls through a grassroots model, which we think will be the most transformative advancement of the 21st century. We work with girls and women, adolescents through early adulthood. We proactively go across the US to work with different populations to catalyze their lived security experiences and bring them to the forefront of this discourse. And we value diversity of ideas of all of the different ways, race, gender, and identity that can contribute to this discourse. It's also trauma-informed. We use a trauma-informed approach because a lot of what we're talking about, specifically in national security, is so fear language driven. So we work with child and adolescent mental health professionals to ensure that girls can have a discourse about security that is constructive and safe in a supportive environment. There are 3 aspects of our model, which are secure, empower, and advance. So we secure with learning modules that are developed by women. We do simulations and gaming, also designed by women, and we have a phased mentor program, which some of you may be involved in. We also work in schools, with schools, and in the community. And right now, of course, everything is virtual and workshops. We also emphasize core competencies. So as part of our work, we don't want there to be a barrier to entry for young people. No technology is required. And we try to provide competencies that kids can use and girls can use that will endure through their professional careers as well. And then I would just end with this quote, which one of our 16-year-olds wrote, which is national security is a conversation. And I think that's such a wonderful way to capture what we're trying to do, which is just bringing girls into a discourse about national security because it matters and building those pathways so that we can advance them into leadership. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And Lauren, I didn't know you were from Chicago. This explains our immediate affinity. I was born in Chicago also. So hi, everybody. My name is Emily Pillaton. I am the founder and executive director of a nonprofit based here in Berkeley, California called Girls Garage. And similar to Lauren, I'll just talk briefly about how this organization came to be and then what it looks like in practice. So my background is in architecture. And I'll just say briefly that I think I've been an architect since I was 1 day old, but didn't have the vocabulary for it. And as a young person, I was very lucky to grow up in a family that was creative and biracial. And my mother is here somewhere. I see her. She'll probably have something to say shortly. I had 2 grandmothers who were librarians and 2 grandfathers who were engineers. And so I think my curiosity and hands-on instincts came from both of them. And when I was 16 years old, I had a seminal experience that made me fall in love with both architecture and the type of architecture that I have gone on to pursue. And that is that when I was 16, I traveled with a group of teenagers from around the country to Central America. And I spent a summer in Belize working alongside local volunteers and masons and carpenters. And I built a town park that was this huge gazebo and benches and all kinds of mini structures. And I remember hand mixing concrete and sweating more than I've ever sweat in my life. And then looking back at this thing and being able to say, I built that. And there was something about that experience that made me understand the impact I could have in the world and how my identity was connected to that as a young woman. And so to fast forward over a decade that followed, I went on to study architecture. I worked in architecture for a minute and then realized I don't do well with bosses or AutoCAD. So I quit and I founded a nonprofit that has evolved into Girls Garage, really to pay back and to pay forward the feeling that I had as a teenager and what it means to be able to transform your physical world through the act of building. So I have a couple slides also, and I'll just breeze through them. I just want you to see what this work looks like in practice. So Girls Garage is where I'm sitting right now. This is our tool wall behind me. And let me just get my, so in this space, we have 3,600 square feet of space. We teach skills like carpentry and welding, graphic design, architecture, engineering, to girls ages 9 to 18. And girls come here, all of our teen girls come here for free. So this means that we're funded almost entirely by donations and grants and corporate sponsorships. The sort of home run of all of this work is to be able to do work for our community. And this means that everything we do is outward facing. We can make wooden spoons and cutting boards to take home, but we can also apply our skills to respond to things going on in our communities. So this is a planter box that we built for a nearby women's shelter. This is a covered sandbox that we built for the nearby preschool. This is a giant parklet bench that is at a restaurant around the corner. It's a public parklet space. And then I wanted to just share this because we're obviously all struggling with the constraints of COVID. And one of the things that we did this past summer, because I believe so strongly that our greatest strength is how we can support girls in all ways, not just through power tools. We gave girls their own starter toolboxes, and as part of our summer program, virtually, asked them and taught them basic carpentry skills to build their own seat at the table. And they each designed and built a chair, and this was a collection of chairs that they all built in their own homes, and then we gathered to see them all together as a collection. So as an organization, we think very much about the whole girl, even though in practice, we're talking about power tools. We're also talking about power. We're talking about voice, how we can use tools as metaphors to physically build the world we want to see. I mean that totally literally, that as a young woman to have agency in the world and get to look at the world as something that you can change and edit, not something that is acting upon you, is a fundamental mind shift. The last thing I want to share is just this most ambitious project that we just finished. This is a chicken pavilion. It feels wrong to call it a coop. It's 500 square feet. So I'll call it a chicken pavilion / campus. This is a project that was built by our most advanced group of teen high school girls over a year, and we finished it this past summer. And I'm showing you this because I think that often we ask ourselves, how do we get more girls into STEM? How do we get more girls into certain types of fields? And perhaps that's the wrong question to be asking. I think the question is actually, what would the world look like if there were more girls in STEM, in building, in the types of industries that get to have a say in what the world looks like? I fundamentally believe the world would be more beautiful and more just and more equitable if girls have a say in shaping it. So this is me on the left at 16 on a ladder in Belize. And this is one of my girls, Naomi, on the right on a ladder. And you'll notice that the difference between these two images is that Naomi is surrounded by other girls and women. And so this is my dream, to create a world where girls are not just builders alone, they're builders together, and to see how that manifests in our built environment and in our lives. So Thank you so much.
So thank you both, Lauren and Emily, and what an amazing journey you two have been on. And a couple weeks ago, Sarah and I had one of the most enjoyable afternoons. Maybe I'm speaking for myself, but certainly one of the most enjoyable afternoons I had in the entire month, because we spent about an hour with Emily and Lauren learning a little bit more about what they each do, and where the sort of intersections were in their work and approach. And what was so interesting to me is that they both, little known to each of them, had worked on construction sites as young women, and had spent most of their time in very male-dominated organizations and career paths. And what came out of the conversation was not only the amazing degree to which they were so connected, almost like they had known each other for their entire lives, but that they had this amazing desire to change vocabulary, to reposition the world in a way that kind of gets rid of the whole gender dominated conversations we have and the vocabulary we use. So I'm going to ask them to speak with one another and all of us about that element.
Sure. Lauren, did you want to start, or I can?
No, I mean, I actually think I have more familiarity with power tool vocabulary. But no, please go. No, please start.
Yeah, I mean, we can start with that though. I was just going to say that there are so many places in our world, especially in technical spaces, where the vocabulary is gender. There are words we don't even think about that are where the male is sort of the default. And when we were talking a few weeks ago, I said something to the effect of like careers in tech and STEM and many male-dominated fields really need a rebrand, that we need to rethink about how we talk about these careers. For example, I think a lot of girls hear STEM or they hear technology and they immediately feel like these are tech, math heavy areas. And yet we know that to be both true, but also that these are highly creative and collaborative fields. And so it's never just one thing. And I think there are so many spaces where even like, tools and hardware, there's a male and a female part. We use words like policemen and firemen, where the male is the default. And we just don't even, you guys, don't get me started on you guys. I mean, why is, like, you would never call me a guy, but if I'm in a group, we're you guys. So what is it about making something plural that makes it gender neutral? It's not. So I'm really interested in how, like, there's so many things that are just innate to how we talk and speak within these industries, and you can't unhear it once you start thinking about how many places and words and spaces were designed for and by mostly men. You can't unsee it and you can't unhear it. And so I think our work is so much about calling attention to that and then dismantling it in a way that feels inclusive and positive and not even more exclusive.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, as noted, I worked construction through college in Chicago, and I ran around and posted 4 persons on all of the mailboxes, behind everybody's backs. But I think national security specifically, I mean, it's the fundamental ideals that define the institutions were rooted in manhood and military preparedness and Americanism. And despite what an executive order that was issued today would like to suggest, sex and race discrimination are fundamental to what our nation has been built upon. And I think in national security specifically, the optics of it, in part because of the emphasis on the military and the intelligence communities, even the optics of it from the way it's represented in pop culture, in film, in marketing, in recruitment ads, it's it's highly, girls find it highly, they're adverse to it, and it doesn't reflect the lived experiences that they have from a security perspective. And I think too, just the verbiage, I mean, nuclear weapons is one that we always talk about in our work. The language is hypersexual as well, which when you're trying to engage younger populations to talk about these really important existential crises, as you said, you can't unhear those things, and those shape a conversation. They have an impact. We see it with girls. They have an impact every day. So like you said, it's part of the change happens when you just start asking them questions, because in order to make the change, we need to understand how they're perceiving the world in which they're living. And certainly from a national security perspective, what we see online, you know, within the kind of digital domain for girls, you know, there's some pretty scary things that are happening. Not to say that they can't be turned around, but it requires bringing them into that discourse to think about how do we reconceptualize these spaces to bring them into it, and then also advance them safely as well.
Great, thank you. And, you know, both of you touch on the notion of fear, in Emily's case, fearless. And you're also really rooting your organizations in building confidence and skills that help serve a young woman, girl, for the rest of their lives. Can you talk, each of you, just briefly a little bit about this notion of fear, fearlessness?
I mean, certainly for our organization, national security has been rooted in the pursuit of freedom from fear. It's guided every policy that we've implemented. It's this quest for an illusion. And so what we say is that girls and women, and particularly people of color, never know freedom from fear. We live with fear. We live amid it. And so what we try to do is not flip that narrative, but put a positive reinforcement on it, which is to say it's a skill set. It's an unsought aptitude, right? But it's still an aptitude nonetheless. And it's one that can have a benefit to girls. And what Emily said about STEM as well is, we hear this all the time from girls about STEM, which is to say, you know, I don't want to go into this, I'm not technical. Well, girls are really good at security, and security cuts across STEM, national security, in the private sector. And so to your point, rather than try to put upon girls these really stringent cultures, invite them into it. They're the innovators. They're kept out of systems, and they find a way to thrive in spite of that. That's innovation, and which is really what we need across industries. And so I think we try to kind of leverage that fear and turn it into a value, and then hopefully shape national security policies that are based on reality and not virility.
Yeah, you know, I'm looking at our wall over here. Our slogan is "Fear Less, Build More," and I'll just say that we worked with a really awesome creative agency to help develop our brand and this slogan. And when I first saw they pitched the slogan to me, "Fear Less, Build More," and I was like, that's horrible, because that makes it sound like all girls are afraid. And then I was like, well, you know what? Like, everyone is afraid. And fear is a hugely useful feeling. In fact, if you don't feel fear, like, you may be a sociopath. Like, that fear is a useful and important emotion. And so I think that part of our purpose at Girls Garage is to help girls understand the shape of their fear and to befriend it, and then understand how to act in the face of it. And so we talk about bravery as a muscle that you can exercise. And as you exercise it more, it gets stronger. It allows you to do other things. But I think it's important to feel fear, and then to do the scary thing and feel what it feels like on the other side. And as you do both those things more, that's not just about welding for the first time. It's not just about using a chop saw for the first time. I had a group of 17 girls who just graduated from college, who've been with us, from high school, who are going into college, who've been with us for 7 years. And many of them said, you know, I had to go to an interview, I had to do this thing, I had to apply to this job or whatever. And that same feeling applies. Like, you're afraid to walk into an interview room with 7 professionals that you have to prove yourself to, but you know what it feels like on the other side. And so I think that's also the role of both our organizations, is helping girls understand the connection and what's on the other side of fear, because ultimately what's on the other side of it is the thing that's going to take you to the place you want to get to. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that we're all afraid, instead of trying to be fearless, to just say fear less, blank more.
Excellent. So we're going to be going to breakout rooms in a moment. And so really quick, this is like the fire round in a way. I'm going to ask each of you to send our guests off to their smaller group discussions with a little prompt. So Lauren, very quickly, what's the call to action?
I think it's what are small steps that we can take as far as reshaping. I mean, this is a big call to action, but we talk about it a lot, is how do you reshape institutions built on outdated ideals? What are actual steps that can be taken to empower girls in those spaces? But it's the institutional change piece that I think we need to talk about.
Fabulous. And Emily, what does success look like ultimately?
I think success looks like spaces in which there are no barriers to entry for any type of human, and that we value everyone's stories and skills and input equally.
Excellent. So Brittany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, of course. So there's not too much that you have to do, thankfully. So if you open up your participant list, you should see the option to raise your hand. So I think we'll try to do it that way. If you want to raise your hand, as Sarah said, we can start just calling on people randomly if we don't have people raising their hand.
I do know there's one person who has a burning question. Emily, I think you know who I'm talking about. It's Emily's mother. So if you'd like to be, I think Emily also warned you, Anna. So if you would like to start, and I know Erica has a question too, but I know if my mother was on this call, I would love for her to join in or to start the conversation. So Anna, if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to have you kind of kick off the Q&A.
Well, I say that whenever people say, "Are you related to Emily Pilliton?" my response is, "I was there when she was born." And so this is such a fabulous group. And I was just saying in our very short breakout room that it's such an interesting intersection of two really amazing fields, and I think both have their own sense of mystery about them. I don't know that this is so much a question, but each of you have obviously had personal experiences where you had to question your own sense of fearlessness or courage and bravery, and I think for a lot of young women, when they're confronted with that situation, they'll say, "What am I drawing from? My experience thus far has not given me a lot of courage." And so what would the two of you say to those young women?
My dad, who was a carpenter, so there's a lot of overlap here. I like to tell the story because it represents who he was, but he was a carpenter and then eventually got into the office because he was such a crappy carpenter. And he would always be bidding against other firms for jobs in Chicago. And every time he lost, he would send someone a thank you note. And eventually at 50, he was pushed out of his company, Turner Construction, and which was really hard to watch because he built his whole career there. And because he had sent a note to someone, he was made a job offer. And it really captures my dad. He had such a wonderful reputation, so much integrity. And so probably I've had quite a few scenarios in life that I would say have been, on varying degrees of trauma, but certainly in a professional setting, when you experience, sexual harassment or assault, having to deal with that in a mature and professional manner because you don't know what you're putting at risk, especially at a young age, is something that requires a lot of, I think it requires a strong inner compass. And so when I had to resign from my job, I wrote an email, a resignation, which I still have. And I drew so much from my father's integrity and strength and determination. And ultimately, it worked out in the end, but it was really that kind of values-based upbringing that I had that I think kept me centered, and also having the support of your parents, right? As I think Emily would share, is that makes things feel a lot less scary when you have to make really big choices. So I really appreciate my mom would be so mad that I'm not talking about my mom, but she's done all kinds of good things too. Happy she's not on the call.
Yeah, when girls are here and they're afraid, or I can tell they are and they're not saying so, this is actually something my therapist taught me, not to turn this into a therapy session, but I think it's helpful to just tell yourself the things that you know to be true. That I'm a strong woman. I know how to weld. I went to college and grad school. I studied architecture. I have a family that loves me. And sometimes I think just telling yourself, instead of trying to repeat a mantra or, you know, pull from some hallmark quote that you heard, those things don't feel very helpful when you most need them. And so I try to ask my girls, like, what feels true about who you are and who supports you, and those are inarguable. And once you rattle them off, you're like, oh yeah, I could do this. I can totally do this. And then you do it once, and then you get to add that thing to your list. I know how to use a chop saw. Like, then when you go to learn how to weld, you're a little less afraid. I also know that a lot of girls worry that saying the things they're good at feels like bragging. Like, I have a 4.0, or I do know how to weld, or whatever the thing is. And I always tell them, like, it's not bragging if you're just stating facts. Like, these are just facts about who you are. So I do encourage them to just like ground themselves in the things that they know to be true, the people who support them, and also know that, like, you're never alone. I'm always standing next to you. Someone's standing next to you, if not physically, like someone's there with you, an ancestor of someone who lives far away. And so these are things we practice too. And, you know, just to get back to the question about fear, like, it is a practice. It's a practice to do things that are scary, and it becomes easier.
I think to your point, Emily, too, about I think the kind of the idea of values is, that's why we always work on every foundation of what we do is ethics. You know, even if girls don't know what the word ethics mean, they understand values they've been raised with. And once they see that exercising their ethics in a decision-making capacity, especially if they feel like they're doing it under a compressed time frame where there are no few good outcomes and very little information, they realize that they do it all the time throughout the course of their lives. They're just not contextualizing it into, you know, a much more significant, quote unquote, significant environment. And so I think there are those just very basic kind of fundamental things that girls can draw from. But to the point that we discussed earlier is we have to create spaces for girls to try those things out and understand that they're supported. And then I think having those experiences, the more frequently they can have them on the front end, the more empowered they feel when they're in that professional environment and they get that first comment or that first question or whatever it is, to have that kind of fortitude.
That's awesome. Thank you guys both for that. And thank you to Emily's mom for the question. I see that Erica's raised her hand. So Erica, if you want to share, and then I know Paul posted in the chat. So Paul, will have you ask your question after Erica.
Sure. So first I have to admit to being a little bit of an Emily Pillaton groupie. I've been sort of watching her progression since she was driving around the country in an Airstream trailer, bringing a lot of what she's doing to communities all over America. And so partly because I've sort of watched your career, Emily, this is a question partly for you, but Lauren, this is for you too. And it's part of what I put in the chat earlier is it's interesting that in a field like national security, or certainly nuclear weapons security, it feels like quite an elite field. You know, a lot of specialized knowledge is required. We did a whole report on this very topic, in fact, the barriers to entry for people coming into this field. But I think the implication for people who stand on the outside of it is, oh, there's stuff I couldn't possibly ever know. There's specialized knowledge probably about the military, probably about technological issues, things that I could probably never know enough about to make a contribution. And then I hear you ask the question, Emily, about how would the world be different if more young women were in STEM careers? And it makes me wonder, how would national security be different? Or the whole perception of what security is about globally be different if all these young women with all the equipment that they bring began to really flood the zone? I'm just curious to hear both of you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we kind of, I kind of put like security in air quotes because, you know, we talk about someday when it's national well-being or national something else. You know, these words aren't set in stone. they're living things. It's just that we've been entrenched in a 100-year history of the same terminology. And I think really that's what girl security is doing. It's challenging norms, it's challenging verbiage, it's challenging, I don't even know that so much of national security is elite, so much as it is elitist. And so I think there's also that place for girls. I mean, when I came from the Midwest, and I was literally wearing like my dad's Who Farted t-shirt under a blazer to a conference because I lost my suit. And I, you know, it was a totally grounding experience in like what this universe was of national security. And so I think there's a lot to be said about, there's like some other stuff going on that needs to change. But I do think we kind of envision a world that girls, so we don't even say gender parity, we say gender majority. What would that world look like when women are the majority of decision makers? We don't know what that looks like yet. How cool is it and exciting is it to think about what that world would look like? So to your point, that's kind of what we're working towards. That is actually what we're working towards.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, I have to give a shout out to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And this past weekend after her passing, I was really in a, I think you all know. And I came to Girls Garage and I made a poster that says, "When there are 9." When she was asked, you know, when will there be enough female Supreme Court justices? And her answer is always, when there are 9. And so when I think about representation, we all know the statistics, right? The statistics are abysmal in all of these industries. And so the question is though, like, why, who cares? Why does it matter? And it is a matter of just basic statistics, but it's also a matter of like every single thing. If you look around the built environment, if you look around our cities, our world, like pretty much everything has historically been shaped by men. And this is not, you know, my plea to say, let's make the world girlier. Like, I actually believe this is true, not just across gender, but across race and age and ability. Our world would be so much more inclusive and beautiful if there were more people that had the ability to shape it. There's a beautiful book called Invisible Women. Some of you may have read it. By Caroline Criado Perez, and she talks about how data specifically, but in so many parts of our world, there are designs that are not inclusive to women, to certain communities. She uses the classic example of that there was a time, and I don't know which iteration of the iPhone it was, where you could ask Siri where to find Viagra, but not an abortion clinic. Or when Sheryl Sandberg was working at Google and asked whoever her superior was, why there wasn't a spot for expectant mothers, a parking spot. And he said, I'd never thought to do that. And so that's not his fault necessarily. That's not done maliciously, but it goes to show that if there had been a woman in the room during the planning of that parking lot, perhaps that would have been a thing. So to me, this is about statistics. It's also just about envisioning a world where more people get to shape it, and that when women get to design the world will be designed for everyone. There's so many examples of this in city planning also. So I think my role and my biggest hope is that the girls who come here have an opportunity to actually do that, to build a chicken pavilion, to do a thing that shapes the world. But then when they go into their careers in whatever it is, in architecture, in medicine, in national security, that they have that experience of knowing the purpose of why it's important for them to have a say in what the world looks like.
I think just to add quickly to your point too, Emily, we've been spending a lot of time on AI and ethics and bias, and it's quite fascinating to listen to women ethicists in AI because it's fundamental to them that bias is unethical. And it should be unethical in every other industry. And so I love the idea of we're bringing that narrative into our the language of our programming. Is it's unethical, and we can create a space in which now, especially with AI, even though of course it's already moving forwardly, this is actually kind of a new space where we can try to disrupt what's happening in the STEM and national security space, and really have an impact on how things are being shaped. So to your point, I think the whole design I think I tweeted, Red Wing didn't even make women's boots when I worked construction. And so I think we've not evolved that far yet. And so we have a ways to go.
Yeah, I just want to share one little fun tidbit. I recently published a book called Girls Garage, and one of the components of the book is these profiles of builder women. And one of the women that I interviewed is an actual Rosie the Riveter. I think she's 96 years old now, and she was a welder in World War II. And she told me a story about how we all know the image of Rosie the Riveter with the bandana. She said that the bandana for the women she worked with, was actually worn around their neck, because when they were given their, standard issue coveralls, they were made for men. And even when they were buttoned up all the way, their neck was exposed. And so when they were doing overhead welds, they would get sparks on their neck. And she said that many of them have like a V-neck pattern of freckles from the sparks from welding, but that they would wear their bandana around their neck to protect them. And I mean, here's another example of just like clothing not being designed for women, the very women who were so instrumental in the war and who we look to as heroes. So I see this question from Laura about the 99% Invisible podcast episode. There's about designing public restrooms that are not gendered. There's just so many examples. And again, like, I just want to say this is not male bashing. This is not like malicious. I don't think that most men are like, let's design spaces that make women feel small and unimportant. Like, I think we just have blind spots. We just need more people in these rooms to say like, hey, this is my experience. Can we design for this too? Everyone will be better off.
Oh, that's great, Emily. Thank you. And so we don't have a ton of time left, but I know Paul had posted a question, which I think actually is going to be a great follow-up to what you were just saying. And then Andrew's raising his hand. So if both of you guys could ask your question, we'll start with Paul and then Andrew really quickly, and we'll get some responses from Emily and Lauren, and then Letha will close it up. So Paul, if you want to start off and share your question really quickly.
Sure, thank you. Thanks both. And Emily, something you just said reminded me. So I have a son and a daughter, and our daughter plays softball. And every single time we would go to watch a softball game and see the baseball field, it was night and day in terms of resources, upkeep, and don't get me started. But my question was, when I see your garage and the tools behind you, I'm like, oh yeah, and I do bike repairs. I've been the neighborhood bike repair like as a side hustle for a few years, and I actually love teaching it. I've done some ad hoc classes, but I wonder, am I, or is a man, the right person or appropriate to inspire or empower young women or girls? Because I'm like, oh, I want to go over to that garage and help them learn how to use a drill or a level, and I'm like, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it has to be the right conditions. I'm curious what Lauren and you feel about that.
Thanks, Paul. And how about Andrew, if you want to ask your question as well, and then we'll have Emily and Lauren take both.
Sure, I'll be quick. Thanks guys for having me. One of the things that I do every fall is help teach a class on nuclear weapons and national security. It's very broad. We get mostly males in the class, and we have, despite some efforts, trouble obviously finding a gender diversity in that class. But one of the things we also get now, thanks to a program, is a lot of active duty Air Force officers come through, and they're almost all men, of course, but people who are true, even more practitioners in the field that we work in than usually the policymakers are, right? They have a lot of ownership and feeling over their weapons that they use. And to try to tie in a couple of thoughts that we had here about language, about building spaces that we actually don't know what they look like quite yet, and about the technical expertise required to be seen in this field as legitimate. One of the things I've been trying to do every fall more and more is to, while we do teach about weapon systems and the specs for a missile and the ranges and the power and the blast and all that things that are very, for as far as blatant facts go, they're pretty masculinized. It speaks to a strength that a lot of men get to have. Trying to challenge those in a way that says, hey, we know you have an expertise in this bomber, we know you have this affinity for this whole system that you've done, but please try to consider the bigger picture. We try to keep that going throughout the class. I find that that's sort of effective in a way when you're trying to change the composition of a field, hopefully some years down the line. By the end of the class, a lot of people who are very gung-ho about how great deterrence is because they get to produce it by, tools on metal kind of approach. A lot of them are doubting what they're doing, or they're asking different questions about it, which I hope makes for an entry level, a better entry for more people in the field eventually when those people are more in charge. So it's something to think about, but also if you guys have any thoughts about how I might better do that, how I might better reach a mostly male field when we have an opportunity to really be educating and to try to spin the conversation so that they leave with a different idea of where they're going.
Those questions feel really connected to me. so to Paul's question, first of all, I appreciate you even asking that. I think that's like, put it this way, there's a lot of male shop teachers who never ask that question and then just have classes full of boys and they go about their 30-year career and nothing changes. So thanks for even asking that. I was at a conference recently and this male maker space teacher came up to me and said, you know, like, I'm trying to get more girls to sign up. Like, how can I decorate my room to get them to come in? And I was like, well, how about you fire yourself instead? I didn't say that, but I think there is something about, let me say this differently. I think if your goal is to teach young people how to do the mechanical things to maintain or build a bike or whatever that is, I actually don't think it matters. And I think there's a way to engage with any human in front of you that's personal and that's loving and instructive. I think when the work becomes connected to like more reflection and identity and what does this work mean to me? What does it mean for like, how might this be a career? How might this be connected to like who I am and where I come from? I do think it matters who the mentor is. And, you know, perhaps there are ways that you as an instructor can also ask like, where are your blind spots? And maybe there's like a co-teacher who you could learn from and they could learn from you, and that is actually the best approach for any student to be a part of. So I do appreciate you asking the question. I think like my sort of gut reaction of fire yourself is not the right one, but like a willingness to retrain yourself is really important. And to ask questions and to look around and ask who your own colleagues are and who you look to for advice.
Yeah, those are terrific. And I think for myself, I mean, I've had wonderful male mentors. I mean, one of the laborers that I worked with looked out for me on all of my job sites and showed me how to use a jackhammer and do all of these great things. He gave me a Beanie Baby when I left for college every year. My maiden name is Bean. But even my mentor who just recently passed away, you know, he leveraged his privilege. He would bring me to a table of all men and let me speak. Really, it was letting me speak because there were men constantly speaking over me. And he would shut the table up and say, this is the person who knows the most about this topic and you need to listen to what she has to say because it's very important. So I think there's ways to be an ally and sponsor in that capacity and just open up and share your spaces where you can. And I think, Andrew, to your point too, as well, like when men in national security and women as well will say, there's no women's literature from World War I and World War II. Women have written vast prose and poetry that is as informative as this old Clausewitz guy. I mean, it's all very informative. And so I think you might want to take a look at what are they reading? Who are their guest speakers? Also, we do a lot of things, it's kind of unconscious bias training in a way, but creating simulations in which you have a woman who provides a role-playing activity and designs a role after her actual, her actual self as she would function in a national security scenario. So I think there might be different ways, and I'd be happy to give you some ideas of what we do in the classroom when we have mixed classes. But Paul, yeah, and Andrew, both to your points, I think it's wonderful and important and meaningful that also girls see men as allies, especially in these male-dominated spaces. And we have lots of mentees, some of who are ROTC, who are reporting sexual assault and sexual harassment. And if not for a male ally who advocated and created a space safe for them, they could have had a less positive outcome than they did. So it's really important.
I just
Thank you
have
so much.
Oh, can I add one
really
last thing? Yeah, no, I'm just reminded, Lauren, you said that so beautifully. I have a colleague named Allison Orapallo, who's a shop teacher, and she's a 15-year veteran shop teacher. And she believes that her greatest impact is not only teaching her female students, but having male students who are learning from her as the expert. And so I think having more women in teaching positions and male students looking to women not as their female teacher, but as the expert in the room is another way to think about those relationships.
This has been awesome. Thank you guys both so much. Let me hand it over to Letha to wrap us up, but thank you guys again.
So thank you, Emily and Lauren. I mean, one of the goals we always have with the Nuclear Mixer series, and in fact, most of the work that PopTech and N Square do independently and together, is to introduce people with very provocative ideas. Because if we just all talk about the same thing all the time and never go outside of the boundaries of quote unquote the norm, we really don't see advances happening. So thank you both for being amazing provocateurs today. And I think you have left all of us with a lot to think about and a lot to take back to our workplaces. And I'd love to thank all of our guests today. I think we had a lovely conversation, which I found really enriching and inspiring. And I really do want to thank you all for joining us for the last hour. And I'm going to quickly turn over to Sarah to say a few words of farewell as well.
Thank you. Thank you, seriously, Emily and Lauren. This was really quite great. And again, thank you to all of you for joining us for yet another Zoom call. But we had an interesting twist in the middle of it. But honestly, thank you all so much for coming. And stay tuned. Our next one will be October 22nd. And we will share a recording of this particular event. So if you wanted to follow up with either Emily or Lauren, we'll be sure to kind of include their contact information. So yeah, thank you so very much again. Stay safe, keep well, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Lauren. Bye-bye.
Opportunity. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.